Hey guys, it's another top five for us. This time with a negative spin. Everybody loves to whinge about Warhammer, and today I want to look at the top five worst feels bad moments in the game. So, what mechanisms create the worst feelings when they come into play in the game? As usual, this is, I suppose, geared towards those at a more competitive bent, but I imagine if you are a casual player, these types of mechanics, especially if used in multiples, are going to cause hard times in your garages and dining rooms across the world. If you are at tournaments, I don't think it's any better. These types of things that are the cornerstones of the best lists in the game. And I think for mine anyway, or for anybody else, they bring to mind the term salty, where people just can't believe that certain things work the way they do in the game. So we'll get to it. The top five worst feels bad mechanisms in Warhammer the Old World. So, just time to shout out Jeff. Thank you, Pandemwargaming, for sponsoring our channel. High quality plastic prints. I don't know how far Pandemwargaming ships to, but I imagine it is at least as far as you're willing to pay for. Again, you'll see throughout this video a lot of the products that Pandemwargaming provide, particularly the bases and terrain that we use in our own videos. So thanks again for sponsoring the channel. And thank you to everybody who is a financial supporter. It does go a long way for us in helping us to provide better production. You'll notice the sound quality and visual quality is getting better and better all the time. That's where that money goes. We're really grateful for those who are able to help us to produce extra high quality stuff so that you can watch these videos, comment, and keep coming back for more. Thank you. So, number five for me is the FBIGO reform. A bit of a funny one for some people, but I think the FBIGO reform is in my top five of the feels bad mechanisms. It doesn't seem like a lot. I think people feel like FBIGO falling back in good order overall is a pretty good thing. I think one of the positive things of the old world is how psychology is muted to some extent. You want it to be part of the game. Morale is a key cornerstone of a rank and flank game. But the old 6th ed and pre-6th ed versions where you failed your terror test and you ran off the board completely, which I guess is still true of terror, but of all panic tests and fear tests and the like at the time, it's a big deal. And you can spend half an hour setting up a game and then it falls apart on you, which is not great. So that's the positives. The bad side of this is that the falling back in good order feels like it's better than winning combat a lot of the time. So falling back in good order, you are getting to drop back a certain number of inches. If it's 1 or 2 inches, then those things like that need impact hits, like chariots, are rendered useless. If it's more, sometimes you get away almost completely from the pursuing unit. You can roll 5 or 6 and they roll 3, 4 or 5, 2 in pursuit. It's happened plenty of times. But then being able to reform into any sort of formation just feels like too big an advantage. Maybe if the pursuer could reform, I know thematically it's sort of like, well, you would say, right, we're going to back up into this formation if things go badly. But yeah, I think it is a bit too much. That the fighting rank is such a mess. See Luke Blaxall's video on what constitutes a fighting rank, probably the peak of his persona performing in his take on Old World 1.5. I found it very funny. But the basics of this fighting rank situation just becomes more and more complex and convoluted. Yet, still, you can probably reforming into a line is something that Paddy and I have shown is very effective, especially with great weapons, being able to hit back them with an enormous amount of tax and strength, often to a weakened enemy, despite that they won the previous combat, is really a big, I think, advantage in many ways. Beyond that, there's the old fleeing through friends where people are becoming much more savvy with how the rules work. And if you put one unit behind your other unit, you can then flee past them, whereas the pursuer will hit that fresh unit. So again, we've made a video about this called the FBIGO trap. I think that's a tactic or even a strategy that you can employ to great effect in this game. And it just doesn't feel good. It feels on the table like you have gained an advantage from doing something crummy that's more of a glitch in the rules than feeling like you were some sort of masterful general in this space. So number 5 for me is the FBIGO reform. Number 4 might shock a few people, but to me, it's cannons. I think cannons, like FBIGO, good for the game. I think cannons being able to, for some of these armies like Dwarves or Empire, and I wish Dwarf cannons were better, there's a whole other video on that, are able to play against things like dragons with a cheaper model, and I think it creates a distinctiveness between the armies. However, are they too easy to use? I think with the Sky Lantern coming into prominence in the metagame, people are going to look again at War Machines because they're probably best placed to take those out. And with mass infantry, things like Stone Throwers might see more play because they're more useful, but cannons are by far the best war machine in my mind, by far. And that's for a number of reasons. It's really their insane ability to hit the target all the time. Firstly, 360-degree line of sight on the pivot. I guess I don't have a huge issue with this, but it does mean it's just part of the package of inescapability from cannons. When your grand cannons have 60-inch range, usually cannons are 48, unless they're attached to something smaller. It's very difficult when they can pivot and face any direction, especially from on top of a hill. Beyond that, they are effectively a laser, a 2D laser that seems to be able to shoot without really any dimension to the shot. There's no width to the shot. If you can see it with a shoestring or string theory, it feels like it's going to hit. And then beyond that, there's the old 10 from the back. Yeah, really, if you choose the spot 10 from the back of the target you want, the odds, I'd have to calculate it, that you're going to hit are quite high, very high, in fact. And apart from, you feel like it, more often than not, it's the 1 in 6 where the cannon's strength 8 to 10 doesn't wound, occurs more than the cannon doesn't hit in the first place. Now, maybe this is all intentional. Cannons, I could see them as a technological advancement, the peak of where we're at in before some sort of steampunk offshoot or modernist take on rank and flank. But in this sort of world, there still seem to be it just feels bad when everything you've got is just, I'm just going to fire these 2 or 3 cannons at it, especially with things like Engineers or the Grand Cathay being able to go again. The Bombards for Bretonian Exiles having a really ridiculous misfired table. It just feels like there's not a lot of downside to them, and that they just hit, they smash you, and you move on. All of those ones I mentioned being D3+1 wounds as well, which is quite significant. So I know that the FAQ improved them a little bit to make it harder to just pick almost an invisible spot, but there's still all around the world different ways that people play cannons where you don't even have to target the unit. We're lucky that very quickly in the area I play in, there had to be a legal target as well, not just a spot on the ground. And since the changes to the woods and hill mechanisms as well, it's slightly better. But to me, it still feels bad that when you throw rush into a cannon, especially with those mid-tier monsters that don't have triple saves and things like that, that they're just toast. The cannons are going to kill it every single time and get their points back. So to me, it's the number 4 feels bad mechanism in the old world. Number 3, again, I don't think a lot of people talk about this, how bad Thunderstomps really are. So really, like on the table, these things feel bad, but also I think they distort the metagame and narrow it. And Warhammer is a game that we have spoken about on this channel being something where for the amount of investment that you put in, you expect a level of diversity and an interesting game where lots of things happen, not just one thing happens. And I think so far, maybe the FBIGO reform doesn't really do a lot to damage that, but both cannons and Thunderstomps shut out other things from the game. So you've got the mid-tier monsters, second-rate war machines. In this case, Thunderstomps, I don't understand why people don't talk more about how busted they really are. So for starters, anything that brings together high strength and AP is what people are going to gravitate towards in the metagame, because they're the two outs. Having low strength and no AP and big AP is costed, like things like Unquiet Spirits and other sorts of effects like that. And then on top of that, high strength with no AP, like impact hits, don't tend to be that good, because then you can play the matchup game and find the model that is weakest to that, which I think is where the skill is in the game, where you try to line up your high strength, no AP thing. If you can send your heavily armored unit into that, for example, it's going to survive more readily. So when you bring those two things together, and -2 AP tends to be where it becomes significant, be taking a 3+ save to a 5+ save, especially in the parry era of the old world, they're incredible. But beyond that, they're just extra attacks. So if you're worried about dragons, sure, fly 10, toughness 6, 9 wounds, these things are bad. They can still lose to combat resolution. When you have 6 attacks, potentially at weapon skill 6/7, and then you have stomps that are D6 +1 sometimes, extra attacks that hit automatically, you can have up to 12 attacks, really. And that just feels bad. When you're doing your best, the best moments in the game is someone takes down a dragon with something smaller, and there just isn't a lot of probability of that happening with what's out there. The cannons, maybe. Even then, with the combined profile ward saves, very tough. But it's the Thunderstomps that mean there aren't mechanisms in the game that beat it, because they tend to whittle back, regardless of what they're fighting, 3 or so wounds. So what happens there is you just never know. Sometimes a dragon comes in, does 10 wounds. Sometimes it's doing 4, but without the Thunderstomps, I would say sometimes it would do just 1. And then you'd be chased off, and I think that there needs to be a place for that in the game. The reality is that hitting automatically when it was poison, when it is things that are able to, like spells, why they were better than just shooting, and now you're seeing an era where the ballistic skill is probably a little bit too high on some models, like some of the Cathay Outriders, Sisters of Avalon, Ushabti. Their ballistic skill is so high and the modifiers are being withdrawn that they just roll less dice. And that's the skill. What's broken often is down to, are you rolling less dice in one capacity? And this is where Thunderstomps are. I really think, D3 stomps, not so bad, but I would love to see them corrected, that it's maybe stomps or attacks, and maybe if you go last, those stomps hit automatically, and it's a choice of either or. So that's where I'm at with Thunderstomps. Number 3 for me, you may not agree. And once again, as you're listening, if you have a different top 5, this one particularly, I'm hoping provokes people into putting their own top 5 in the comments. I know for a lot of you out there, there's things that drive you mad playing this game, and I think it's worth talking about. Get it off your chest below. Number 2 for me, probably less likely that people are okay with this, but maybe they didn't think it was number 1. Maybe they thought it was number 1. So the 360 charge thing just feels so bad. The threat radius that you create then is massive, and obviously we then move towards what has the biggest threat radius, which on the screen you can see it's the pegs, and they can fly 19 declarable, or maybe 22 with the banner of Impetuous. So in any direction. So when you're playing this game, often against Bretonnia, you got to wait for them to move first, because their threat potential, which is how good players tend to play, is so wide. So they can just go anywhere. So you've got a hedge that move up as if you don't know if they're going to charge your right flank or your left flank, which is pretty crazy to think about. That effect can be replicated with a lot of other things on the ground. While the Pegasus is probably the worst offender in the format, you can get a Stag Rider. You could have just a guy on a horse, particularly armies that have steeds that are like 9 or 8. At 360, like a Demigriff is pretty well armored. You can get a 2+ save off there. Monstrous Cavalry, you're able to go 360. And I think that that's something that just creates this level of threat. Even it could be a magic missile unit. So I still think Pegasus Riders, like we know the Empire Pegasus spam thing was a big deal in the early days of the format. I think the Dark Elf one is really great for the same reason. But anything that has 360 line of fighting, light of sight, and can move that far, it just feels bad because you don't know what to do. You're trying to fight a strategic game, but you don't feel like you've got any options. The thing is too that when you have 360 degree rank line of sight, you've got an exponential level of potential compared to your regular front rank arc model. So that is how the game, I think, should have been played. Dragons, for everything they're great at least they just have a front arc and you can evade them. And that creates a game of movement and strategy rather than just wait and see and hope they don't roll on the dice what they get when you have no option except to hit these things with ranged attacks, which is why the format is starting to look like that combination of skirmisher type models and ranged attacks. Regardless of people trying to bring infantry back, you're still seeing the armies out there that are shaped like this. Rank and flank. What's meant to be a rank and flank game? Well, it's meant to have morale. It's meant to have models that have arcs. And I think that the old world has done a better job with morale for particularly a fantasy game, but it needs to get back to this idea that models have a front arc, a rear arc, and flank arcs, and advantages for being able to outmaneuver your opponent, because it is a game of movement first and foremost, and being able to get the odds in your favor. However, you might think this is infuriating, and pegs, I know, drive people mad all around the world. But number one, and I almost think when you see it, you'll know that this is what drives people the most. It is Resurrecting the Fallen. Whether it's Tomb Kings or vampires, and it probably hits two of the most unliked army. There are people who I know, who I might be related to, who just refuse to play against undead casually. I think this ability, while thematic, is so overpowered in the format that it has created a distortion that, people will just want to flip the table. Resurrecting the Fallen, whether that's through the Tomb Kings and Mortuary Cult, so having access to multiple models that can do this, or with vampires while you could take multiple necromancers, you also have the magic item that lets you use Scepter de Noiro that you can use twice a turn. It's just uninteractive, so there's nothing you can do. Like on the first turn, they can be raising zombies back past what their maximum unit size is for vampires, at least anyway. And then beyond that, if the necromancer isn't in combat, and it's not very easy with the targeting lone characters restrictions or the way champions protect models in units to get to these models, just changing a strategy to kill the death of a general is not easy to do in the old world. We've definitely researched this, not for lack of trying. But on top of that, it's just certain, like it's going to happen. So if they stay out of combat, it's certain, because even with Leadership 8, you've got the reroll from the Battle Standard Bearer, which again, for some reason, is a little bit overpowered. You would think that all of the advantages that you get from being immune to psych and unbreakable, causing fear, that maybe you could just give up on having a Battle Standard Bearer, give it its emotional power over people. I can't imagine skeletons looking up at a battle stand and feeling renewed vigor to fight. Even the somewhat living, even though they're still called necromantic undead or whatever the Tomb Kings are called, it is certain that you're getting it off every turn. And finally, what I'll say about this is it feels over the top that when it is played, you can, in a game, have taken 20 casualties, and just bringing them back means the opponent's not going to get points for that unit. So it just feels futile. It's like, why engage at all? And that, to some extent, doesn't feel like Warhammer to me. So while your mileage may vary, to me, and I'm playing vampires this weekend competitively, Resurrecting the Fallen feels the worst out of these mechanisms. But that's it. If you go back to it, you'll see that I have picked FBIGO Reform, Cannons, Thunderstomps, 360-degree charge, and Resurrecting the Fallen as my top 5 for the feels bads moments in Warhammer. I'd love to hear from you below. We always appreciate subscribe, financially supporting the channel. It goes a long way to us continuing to make these videos. So thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you next time.